A message from your scribe.
In the mid-4th millennium BC, the power of Uruk flourished, and small scattered communities in the Near East began to consolidate and lay the foundations for the first true urban structures. At the same time, thousands of kilometers away in Europe, similar processes were taking place. In the forests of present-day Romania and Moldova, as well as on the vast plains of today's Ukraine, enormous settlements for that time were emerging. The first settlements of the mysterious culture were discovered at the end of the 19th century, in the villages named Cucuteni and Tripilia. The people forming these communities remain silent to us today. We cannot ask them, nor can we answer the question of what they called themselves. Similarly to other groups of people we've come to know through archaeological sources, these communities are defined by the objects left deeply underground. The people inhabiting Cucuteni, Tripilia, or other nearby settlements are currently known as painted ceramic culture, or simply Cucuteni Tripilian culture. And although the representatives of this culture are geographically close to us, in contrast to civilizations like the Sumerian, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture receives significantly less attention. While there is indeed much to discuss, as we are talking about one of the largest cultures of the so-called Old Europe, or pre-Indo-European Europe, which, if we have the courage to say it, can be called the first European civilization. Larger European settlements, even in the late Chalcolithic period, were rather rare. And even if they did appear, they could always be expected in certain specific locations. There was still plenty of vast open space, so Europeans carefully selected areas for their future settlements. Therefore, larger villages had to be looked for, not in random river valleys or on every fragment of the sea coast, but rather in places particularly favorable for settlement and defense. We have Tel Belo Burdo, possibly inhabited even from 6th millennium before Christ, located almost within the administrative borders of today's Belgrade. People who had been living in there for many millennia could not complain about the favorable location in the bend of the Danube and the fertile land that they successfully cultivated. Another example is the remains of various settlement activity in today's Andalusia. People living there during the Chalcolithic era left behind earthen ditches, remains of palisades, and finally large stone circles. The structures found in Marroquíes Bajos or in the town of Valencina de la Concepción are located in one of the largest territorial archaeological sites in Europe. Their monumental character was attributed to collective labor, harnessed to work through social inequalities, coercion, or religion. In other words, historians and archaeologists sought something that would allow them to call Andalusian structures as products of civilization. More recent research, however, has shown that these stone fences, graves, and everything else found at Spanish sites might not be the remains of fortified settlements that were inhabited permanently, but only meeting places of people who lived rather scattered on a daily basis. We could continue this way by returning to the Balkans and mentioning other bigger settlement units. However, regardless of whether we are in the Balkans, Andalusia, or Central Europe, nowhere will we find human settlements on a scale such as those left behind by the representatives of the Cucuteni Tripilian culture. The mega-structures found in Romania and Ukraine are of a remarkably large scale if we are talking about Chalcolithic Europe and even the world. According to safe assumptions, we are dealing with a settlement or settlements easily exceeding 10,000 inhabitants. Bold calculations estimate that in the biggest settlement, namely Maidanechke, in the peak period around 3700 BC, there could have been living even 46,000 people. Therefore, we are dealing with a culture that left behind over 3,000 settlements covering an area of over 300,000 square kilometers, stretching from the peaks of the Carpathians in the west to the Black Sea in the south, or today's Kyiv in the northeast. At the same time, the largest of its habitats sometimes had over 2,000 buildings, and in their heyday, their scale was as large as the cities in the Fertile Crescent. Yet you will not read about the Cucuteni Tripilia culture as being equal to civilizations that flourished many kilometers away in the Middle East. Why is that? Well, there's several reasons behind it. First of all, our mysterious culture was a bit late in the race to be called the world's first civilization. The first settlements, as I said in the introduction, were found in the villages Cucuteni in today's Romania and in Tripilia near Kyiv at the end of the 19th century. For a long time, however, finds scattered over such a large area were not identified as manifestations of one and the same cultural complex. This only happened several decades later as research progressed, and it progressed very slowly for very obvious reasons. First, these areas were hit by 2 world wars and then something equally unfavorable: the communist regime. The communist authorities were therefore not particularly interested in legit archaeological research of prehistoric cultures. And if they did, it was only to prove the point that egalitarianism was there since the Chalcolithic. Meanwhile, time passed. When the labels of the first civilizations were attached to the Egyptian or Mesopotamian civilizations, the Cucuteni Trypillian culture was still relatively poorly researched, and archaeologists were basically on their own, and had to conduct geomagnetic survey, for example, totally on their own. And even now, research on the eastern areas of the Trypillian culture, that is, where the largest settlements were located, is hampered by another conflict that haunts these lands. But even if the remains of thousands of houses hidden underground had been thoroughly described in a sufficient number of frequently cited works by archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century, they still might not have had a chance to be called the first world civilization. And all this because of this guy. Vere Gordon Childe was an Australian archaeologist who made quite a revolution in, you wouldn't guess, archaeology. Thanks to him, all the finds that had previously been simply unclassified as one of the conventionally designated eras were finally analyzed in a broader social context. The ship and the tool used to produce it symbolize the entire economic and social system. The canoe also implies some form of economy or social structure. The bronze axe that replaces the stone one is not only a more perfect tool, but also indicates that we are dealing with more complex societies. Today it may seem quite weird, but before such publications, the excavated archaeological finds were classified in very primitive way. Knowledge about ancient civilizations was categorized using only two vectors, that is, time and advancement of technology. There was no concern about what a given object could tell us about the social or moral structure, and even if it was done in a very conservative way. It was Gordon Childe who pointed out that certain sociological conclusions could be drawn only using archaeological material. The result of these conclusions is the term of Neolithic Revolution, which, as you can see, has made a great career and now defines whole changes in development of societies. But the researcher coined one more term, now somewhat outdated, but which still makes other historians not brave enough to call human settlements other than the Mesopotamian ones manifestations of civilization. And what I mean is the concept of urban revolution, that is, the process by which small agricultural settlements gradually transformed into large, complex communities. What is particularly important is that social relations in such habitats are to be based not on kinship, but on economic or class differences, and the key technology is to be writing, which enables population management. That is why Mesopotamia holds the palm of priority among world civilizations. But this happened because it was the Mesopotamian city-states that were the basis for developing this model. Based on it, you can then classify other human societies and label them civilized or not. This probably corresponds to what the inhabitants of Uruk thought about themselves and the contrast between them and the less technologically and culturally advanced peoples living in the wastelands of Mesopotamia. The very way in which archaeologists change their perspective on given civilizations is incredibly interesting, and the figure of the Australian historian deserves a separate material. But now let's take a closer look at the Cucuteni Trypillian culture. Using the same model created by Gordon Childe and which gave Mesopotamia primacy, let us try to determine how civilized our mysterious European culture is. Gordon Childe's list has 10 points, and we will grant points in a completely subjective and selective way, referring to the achievements of the Cucuteni Trypillian culture. In terms of size, the first cities must be more extensive and more densely populated than any previous settlements. This is the first condition set by an archaeologist. Meanwhile, a typical settlement of the Cucuteni Trypillian culture had about 20 to 50 buildings and was usually located in a naturally defensible place, for example, on a small hill or in a river bend. In parts of the circle around the village that were not suitable for effective defense, its inhabitants constructed simple earthen barriers in the form of ditches or ramparts. This fairly consistent pattern of smaller settlements is, however, disrupted by several larger settlement centers. Hundreds or even over 2,500 buildings arranged in characteristic concentric circles or ellipses in the larger sites on an area exceeding 400 hectares is evidence of a significantly developed socio-economic structure. After all, several tens of thousands of people would not build their houses according to a certain pattern by accident. The slow evolution process of the Cucuteni Trypillian culture, changing the landscape of the village from those with several dozen buildings to large cities, lasted for millennia. It began in the middle of the 5th millennium before Christ and ended somewhere around the end of the 4th century, so even before pyramids were built in distant Egypt. The reorganization and growth of settlements might have happened because of the Cucuteni Trypillian pottery. already in the early stages of the development of this culture, evidence of specialization in the production of high-quality clay vessels can be found at archaeological sites. People in these early production centers crafted vessels from fine grain, good quality clay, and then fired them at very high temperatures, which resulted in an excellent product. The development of technology went hand in hand with increasingly better ceramics. At the beginning, the vessels were probably produced in the most primitive way, so by creating cylindrical clay strings and putting them on each other. But we have certain indications that later in the settlements of the Cucuteni Tripol culture, a primitive form of the potter's wheel was used, which became well established in Europe only in the Iron Age. The furnaces used for firing vessels also gradually changed, and in the later periods, two-chamber furnaces were used, in which the temperature was under constant control of the operator and oscillated around 900 degrees Celsius. The form, size, and patterns on the discovered vessels indicate that they played a major role in storing food, and it was the development of ceramics technology that directly contributed to population growth. Let us move on to the next measures of civilization, which are work specialization and social stratification. In the settlements of the Cucuteni Tripilian, we would probably find specialized farmers, herdsmen, and craftsmen, but among these people will there be a place for merchants, officials, or priests, and finally people who manage it all? And do all these people work full-time? Unfortunately, in this case we can only rely on circumstantial evidence. The very existence of huge settlement centers with a standardized shape and quite solid defensive structures might prove that point. The construction of such structures requires a large and organized workforce, which consequently requires a certain degree of management, and thus the specialization of work into at least three main branches, so we need farmers and finally builders and craftsmen. The evidence for the existence of the class of potters is quite obvious, and is manifested in the fact that in some, usually external sectors of the village, much more pottery utensils, vessels and tools are found than in other areas, which proves the existence of perhaps even entire production workshops. Moreover, the size of the settlements of the Cucuteni Tripilian culture, and here we encounter a problem. A ruling class that would redistribute these goods should appear in specialized societies, and its traces cannot be found in archaeological sites in Romania, Moldova, or Ukraine. This does not mean that some stratification did not occur, but perhaps it was based on family and tribal relations, which were definitely far from what researchers consider civilized. The societies were rather egalitarian, but the word rather is key here because we cannot say anything with certainty. We would probably look for traces of social stratification in burials, but unfortunately too few of them were found to definitely attribute them to our cultural complex. Perhaps these people did not bury their dead and, like the cultures of this and earlier periods, burned the bodies or left them in forests at the mercy of wild animals. Many hypotheses have been presented so far, but due to lack of evidence, all of them remains unconfirmed. We can therefore only shrug our shoulders and say that there was probably some sort of the class system, but just like the level of specialization in society, it was not very high. Exactly what one would expect from a society at the dawn of the Bronze Age. We should now check off a few more points from our list. Regarding sophisticated style and art, unfortunately, the patterns depicted even on pottery are precisely what Gordon Childe would expect from a Neolithic or Chalcolithic culture. Moreover, he even believes that Paleolithic art was more attractive because it attempted to represent objects in a natural and realistic manner. The change was supposed to occur only in the art of Egypt or Mesopotamia. As for writing or the development of exact sciences such as arithmetic or geometry, unfortunately we do not find evidence of them in the archaeological record. Thus, we are left with the matters of economy and trade. Civilizations should primarily be distinguished from primitive societies by the surplus of resources produced by individual producers. The cultivation of grains results in the accumulation of reserves and a surplus of food, especially when people employ more sophisticated agricultural techniques. And indeed, there were surpluses in the communities of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, but they were not large enough for any social group to use them to establish hierarchical social relationships. Or perhaps, none of the members of the communities were ambitious and greedy enough to want to control these resources. Most households were self-sufficient, providing space for cooking, pottery firing, and weaving fabrics. Since almost every household was self-sufficient, trade was rather rare. More skilled craftsmen probably exchanged their products for specific goods, and may have even traveled with them to neighboring settlements. However, internally, within the settlement, resources were rather managed collectively. Surpluses, be they from crops, hunting, or more refined ceramics and clay figurines, were shared altruistically. This phenomenon is called a gift culture and is attributed to Neolithic, primitive societies. Social status and relations among village members of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture were built on mutual support and selfless exchange of goods, aimed at increasing the overall well-being and prosperity of each individual. According to Gordon Child, this is a sign of a primitive society. However, I will leave a whole point to our Neolithic friends for this form of economy, which I personally find very appealing. Finally, a civilization should erect monumental public utility buildings that not only distinguish a city from any village, but also symbolize the concentration of additional resources produced by the community. According to our calculations at this moment, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture is considered a civilization by 40%. So let's see if we can compare the most monumental structures from the steppes of today's Ukraine to Mesopotamian ziggurats.